Hi everyone, welcome to Epic Chess, the channel that helps you improve your chess fast. Today we're going to be looking at the positional concept of creating weaknesses and then exploiting those weaknesses once created. To do that, we're going to look at a game that was played between Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces and Wesley So with the black pieces. This was played in the recent Meltwater Tour finals, and it was a rapid play event, so it's worth bearing that in mind when we look at the moves. So Magnus opens up by playing pawn to b3. This is known as the Nimzo-Larsen attack because Aron Nimzowitsch used to play this, and so did the famous Danish grandmaster Bent Larsen, who was playing in the 1970s. Wesley responds with pawn to b6. We have pawn to e4 now from Magnus, staking a claim to the centre. Wesley attacks that pawn with bishop to b7. Magnus defends with knight to c3. Now we have pawn to e6 from Wesley. Now this isn't a bad move. It does prepare to later push d5 in the centre because you're now supporting that d5 square. It also opens up this king's bishop so that it can now develop out into the game. However, possibly Wesley could have considered another move such as pawn to e5 or pawn to c5 to stake a claim in the centre of the board. But e6 isn't a bad move. Wesley just has to accept now that he'll be playing with less space than Magnus. Magnus plays bishop to b2. Wesley goes knight to f6. In a way, a slightly provocative move because now it entices Magnus forward to take more space in the centre with pawn to e5. So Magnus pushes on, Wesley jumps the knight into d5, Magnus chops, and Wesley now recaptures. And this is quite a nice trade for Magnus really because he's gained this space in the centre. The eyes of his b2 bishop are now open, and arguably this bishop on d5 is slightly misplaced. It will probably have to retreat at some point in order to not get trapped by a developing knight to c6. Now Magnus's next move is quite instructive. He plays the queen out to g4, exerting pressure immediately on the black king side on this g7 pawn. This means that the king's bishop now can't develop harmoniously, and it puts the question to black as to how he actually wants to develop his pieces. And this is where Wesley plays pawn to h5, instantly looking to kick the queen away. Now this in itself isn't a bad move. Magnus now drops the queen across to f4, keeping it on an active square in the centre. And here Wesley now lashes out further with pawn to g5. And this move I don't love so much necessarily. Although I can see what Wesley's trying to do. He's gaining space. He's trying to punish Magnus for bringing the queen out too early. It does, however, leave weaknesses behind these pawns, which Wesley will later have to contend with. And because Magnus hasn't yet castled his king, Magnus can always go queenside here, and therefore it's not like Magnus has already committed the king to the king side, and these pawns are now storming down the board at the white king. So Magnus drops the queen back to e3, and Wesley now makes a further pawn move, pawn to a5. And again, although this isn't such a bad move, I don't necessarily love it because once again it neglects the development of a minor piece. So Wesley has now made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawn moves in his first 9 moves, and we can see here that he's neglecting piece development because the only other pieces he's developed have been the king's knight and the queenside bishop, and both of those pieces have moved twice in the opening as well. Magnus now plays pawn to a3, preparing to meet a4 with pawn to b4. Wesley drops the bishop back to b7, again quite instructive that if he'd just simply developed the knight straight away, that bishop would have been trapped on d5. Magnus plays knight to f3, hitting this g5 pawn. Wesley continues to push on with pawn to g4. Magnus jumps into the centre of the board, and now Wesley develops his queen's knight, challenging Magnus's knight here in the centre. And again, this is quite an instructive moment, so perhaps have a think about what you might play in this position. So here Magnus plays knight to b5, and the reason this is a good move, positionally speaking, is quite subtle, and that's something that I definitely want to teach through this channel, is why the strongest players in the world play these kinds of moves where we would perhaps have played something different. So an amateur player maybe would have just chopped that knight on c6, or perhaps played something different like, say, queenside castles. But the problem with all of these moves is that black now gets to trade this pair of knights, thus freeing up his position, because as we can see here, this black knight on c6 currently doesn't have any squares to hop to. It can't hop to e5 because white is occupying that square with a pawn. It can't hop into b4. it could try to maneuver back to e7 to look to come into f5 or d5, but because of white's space advantage, white will always have the ability to maneuver around this piece and potentially kick it at a later point with a c4 move or by chopping with his own knight. So it's really instructive what Magnus plays here. He actually just jumps the knight into b5 and says to Wesley, my white knight on b5 is better placed here looking into your position than your knight is here with very few jumps. And it's also closing in your b7 bishop, which now has its scope greatly reduced because it's being blocked by its own piece. So it's a subtle move here, but an important one to note down. Wesley now plays bishop out to h6. Magnus moves the queen across to c3. So it's quite an interesting game of cat and mouse. Although Magnus brought the queen out early and he's been pushed around a little bit in the opening, and arguably that would be a no-no that we learn very early on in chess, what he's doing here through this queen excursion is creating weaknesses in the black position. So by positioning this queen on the king side, he's provoked these two pawn weaknesses, and now the black king is going to have a tough time finding safety because the king side is looking very drafty, and on the queen side it's going to be very difficult to get this queen out of the way to a good square and then get castled to safety when you've also pushed the a-pawn and you've got this white knight peering over into your position. So after Magnus plays the queen into c3, Wesley actually now drops the bishop back to g7, hitting this e4 pawn, and Magnus obliges with the defense of it by playing pawn to d4, further gaining space in the centre. And although this pawn push to d4 now turns the bishop on b2 into a bad bishop because it's staring at its own central pawns, this is the lesser of two evils here because Magnus had to control his central pawns here or else he'd be losing the game simply. Wesley now plays pawn to d6, and this is what Magnus realises as well, that Wesley has to break in the centre at some point, and so this bishop on b2 isn't likely to stay permanently bad for the whole of the game. Magnus takes on d6, pawn now recaptures, and already we can see that Wesley has some issues with his pawns. This pawn on d6 is now a weak pawn. This pawn on b6 is weak and backward. And so Magnus is already starting to create targets in the black position, especially when we couple that with the weak pawns on the black king side here. So Magnus now already starts to undermine those pushes by Wesley. He plays pawn to h3. Wesley now plays pawn to f5 to try and hold everything together. And this is really a horrible move which sums up the struggles that Wesley is having in this position. A better move here would have been to play, say, something like pawn takes h3, and then Magnus has a couple of different options around recapturing. He can even play queen to g3, hitting this bishop, and if black were to get greedy and take another pawn, then Magnus actually develops a further piece into the game with devastating effect. This bishop is now raking down the diagonal. This pawn on d6 is weak under attack by both of these pieces, and the bishop on g7 is attacked. So it's a very dire position for black to be in here. Anyway, this didn't happen in the game. Wesley played pawn to f5 here, but again he's further weakening his king. So we've now got a very drafty king here on the king side, and Magnus punishes this really nicely. So Magnus plays pawn takes g4, Wesley recaptures with the h-pawn, Magnus swaps the rook, bishop takes, and now he brings the queen across to g3, a very similar theme to the variation we just looked at, hitting this pawn on d6 and asking black how he wants to defend, and also looking to come to the h-file here and then threatening to deliver deadly checks, as well as hitting this undefended bishop on h8. So Wesley now plays pawn to e5, again a really horrible move with how it continues to push pawns in the centre of the board where his king is, but at this point it is difficult to offer too much of an alternative because the position's now very bad. Magnus now plays queen to h2, not capturing that pawn in the centre, and again this is instructive because Magnus now picks up a further tempo, hitting this bishop which has to now defend itself. So Wesley plays king to d7, the queen now defends the bishop, and Wesley's looking to run away with the king. Magnus plays queen to h7, and Wesley blocks with the knight here. If he were to drop the king back to c8, then the problem with this move is that Magnus simply picks up this f5 pawn with check, and everything is collapsing once again. Alternatively, if Wesley were to play queen to e7 to block, then the same thing can happen. Queen takes pawn on f5. So here Wesley blocks with the knight, and now Magnus sees that it's the right moment to capture this pawn in the centre. D takes e5, again ripping open further lines against the black king. Wesley desperately tries to exchange queens here with queen to g8, but Magnus is having none of it. He drops his queen back to h6, saying no thank you, I don't want to swap queens when I've got such a devastating attack. I don't want to help you free up your pieces. Instead, Magnus laterally attacks this d6 pawn. Wesley now plays queen to g6, again trying to get the exchange of queens to happen, but Magnus again declines, drops the queen back to d2, threatening this d6 pawn still, because there are now 1, 2, 3 white pieces attacking this pawn, which is only defended by 2 black pieces. And here Wesley had actually had enough. He threw in the towel because the position is so overwhelmingly lost. Magnus will soon be castling kingside, at which point his rook will be joining the attack, and he still has a ton of deadly threats, including bringing this white squared bishop into the game. So a really instructive game from Magnus. It was really nice to see how he punished the weaknesses that Wesley left in the position by these pawn moves, and how he actually probed away with his queen and pieces to create more pawn weaknesses as the game went on, and that was then devastatingly punished in a nice finishing sequence that we can see here, and Wesley actually had enough before playing the game out. So I hope you got something from that video, especially on the concept of creating weaknesses in your opponent's position and then looking to exploit them. If these videos are helping you, do smash that like button, leave me a comment down below if there's anything I can help you with, or if there's any videos you want to see again in the future. And as always, thanks for watching, and hope to see you again in another video.